Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken, executive editor at the Mises Institute. And today we're going to talk about something that's we're told is going to happen next year. And this is the economy of Poland in terms of GDP per capita will be catching up with the economy of Japan, interestingly, which we've always been told for decades is just one of the richest countries in the world. So we're going to explore this topic a little bit with Łukasz Dominiak, Professor Dominiak. He is a professor of political philosophy at Nicholas Copernicus University in Poland. So even for those of us who have researched the Eastern European economy off and on over the years, I wanted to draw upon a little bit of his experiential knowledge with Poland. And of course, obviously, he's got book learning when it comes to the Polish economy as well. So we're going to talk about that. What is it about Poland's economy? Does this ring true? Has Poland's economy improved a lot over the last 30 years? That seems obvious, right? Since they were a communist economy in 1989, and then the Cold War ended. But what we see in a lot of the data is that the Polish economy has improved more consistently and more dramatically than many other similar economies. And of course, as we've seen, it's improved and grown while the Japanese economy has somewhat stagnated. And just before we get into it, I'm just going to throw out some basic stats for you. This was announcements that came out of the IMF and World Bank. Basically, what they're saying is that Poland has caught up with Japan, and in fact, in 2026, will exceed Japan's economy by this measure, that is GDP per capita. So what this means is that Poland's GDP per capita went up by $31,000, and this is all in adjusted stuff for purchasing power parity and all that sort of stuff. So these aren't just like raw nominal numbers. Poland's economy went up by 31,000 by this measure from 1990 to 2023. In 1990, Poland's GDP per capita was $12,800. That was about the same as Brazil and still $4,000 behind Mexico. And similarly, back in 1990, in contrast, back in 1990, Japan's was $35,300. So a big gap there, but that gap's now been erased. So in 2023, that is the most recent data we have, Japan was at $45,900. And so certainly gone up since 1990. But Poland now at $43,500. Almost totally closing that gap, and then in a couple of years, it's going to be there's going to be no gap at all, with Poland being higher. So, Łukasz, does this ring true to you? Have you seen a big improvement? I mean, you're old enough to have perspective on this. You're not like 20 years old, so you've seen some real changes over time. And would you say that generally this seems like something that matches up with the general Polish experience?
Yes, there's no doubt about it. I mean, when you really look at what has happened over these years, reaching back to the 90s, or even, that's, again, I mean, I have the same story all the time, anytime we talk about Poland. But on the other hand, you asked me about some personal experience. So my personal experience, which is quite striking for me, is I remember visiting the US for the first time in 2003, which was before Poland entered the European Union. And when I was back then, I was taking part in this exchange, work and travel, and my impression was that the US is, well, it's not literally heaven on earth, but it was pretty close, I would say, from my point of view. And of course, as you know, now I come visit the US quite often, and I don't have this impression anymore. It's not like, things went worse in the US necessarily. I don't think so. And we actually know they didn't necessarily. It's basically that they improved a lot in Poland. So yes, basically that there's no doubt about it. We have made a huge stride in development over these 35 years. Absolutely.
Well, and what are some of the factors behind that? Now, the narrative that those of us who study the topic have been told is that, right, the end of the Cold War came. Poland was able to pursue normalized relations with the West and able to get away from the hardcore price controls and market controls that essentially the communist regime, with at the encouragement of Moscow, had imposed on Poland. And the name that comes up often is Leszek Balcerowicz, who imposed or encouraged the adoption of what has often been called shock therapy. This was also employed in some places in Latin America, right? This is the idea that we're just going to cause severe economic change, which will be in the short run very painful and difficult, but in the long run will lead to significant changes in economic growth. And so the argument is that Poland, even more so than a lot of the other Eastern Bloc countries that switched over, Slovakia, Hungary, certainly Romania, adopted market reforms much more enthusiastically than these other countries. And that helps to explain why Poland, if you look at the changes over time from 1990 to 2023, it's very consistent. And Poland started out as one of the poorest among the Eastern Bloc countries that came over, and also started showing improvement before it joined the EU. This is an important factor as well. Started showing consistent improvement over that more than 10 years between the end of the Cold War and joining the EU. And can you tell us what some of that in terms of on the ground looked like? Like, what changed about the economy? What was so regulated? What was so different? It's not like Poland completely got rid of a welfare state or anything like that. It's not like it's some sort of anarcho-capitalist country now. But what did change over that time that we would point to and say, yes, the country moved much more toward a real market economy?
Yes, I think, maybe I will mention two things. So on the one hand, maybe I will have a little bit of, story about, story from the books, if you will, right? So what really happened and, maybe what's responsible for that success. And on the other hand, maybe I will again, drop some personal stories also connected to that fact, and as you said, on the ground sort of knowledge. So I think this is very important to have in mind that all these countries from the Central Europe, they made great development within these years, and so first of all we should have that in mind, and second of all, we should maybe then investigate into the reasons why Poland specifically sort of stands out in this group of countries, because it does, I think. And one of the reasons is one of the reasons is the reason you mentioned, which is when we look at the economic situation in Poland and in other Central Eastern European countries. In the 1990 or around that time, then you're right. You will see that Poland was one of the poorest, and even though it was one of the poorest, it improved so much that now it's catching up with countries such as Czech Republic, which is actually having a little bit better performance, I think, still than Poland. But this catch up is clearly visible. And I think that the reason for that, well, there are many reasons, but I think particularly important reason was exactly the one mentioned by you, which was the way of approaching the transformation, and economic transformation in particular back then. Of course, you mentioned the most popular part of that, which was Balcerowicz plan. That was a plan implemented by Professor Leszek Balcerowicz. But of course, in Poland, we also know that the entire process actually started a little bit earlier. That it started in 1988, which means that it started actually already under communist regime, under Rakowski's government. And what I mean is particularly popular amongst Polish liberals and Polish libertarians is basically Mieczysław Wilczek's law or act that was introduced in Poland in 1988 and took force from 1989, which introduced some important elements of laissez-faire, if you will. Legal regulations that allowed Polish businessmen and entrepreneurs to basically start the economic activity without state control or without state concessions and licenses and regulations. So the process started a little bit earlier, and then we of course had Balcerowicz plan, and he was rightly classified as shock therapy. And in this respect, Poland was different than other countries of the region, because if you look at, let's say, Czech Republic or Slovakia, let's say Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Hungary, mentioned by you as well, they took more gradual approach to introducing these market reforms in their countries. Poland took the shock therapy path, and other countries that also sort of took this shock therapy path were the Baltics. So I think the most prominent example would be Estonia, but also Latvia and Lithuania. And when you look at these countries, they perform very well as well right now. So I guess a point might be made that the fact that Professor Balcerowicz and Tadeusz Mazowiecki's government back then, they decided to introduce these very shock and quick reforms, that it sort of played out well in the longer run, because the first, we can say, they started the reforms from the 1st of January 1990, and the first effects, economically speaking, I think were good effects were visible already. For sure, 1992 we already had the economic growth in Poland. Inflation dropped, dramatically over the first year, actually from around, I think, like 600% to first to 60% or something like that. So that would be, I think, one of the reasons that the shock therapy approach that was taken. It was tough, of course, and Balcerowicz plan is, I would say, rather unpopular. If you talk to people on the streets, and especially if they come from, let's say, manual workers, people maybe, mainly farmers, then you will see that the assessment of what happened is actually negative. So of course the social cost was pretty high for some strata of society. So that would be one thing, which is basically economic reforms. Another thing that I think is worth mentioning, but maybe we'll come back to that later, would be our accession to the European Union, which played, I think, also a very important part in this development. And also there are some differences when you look at how Poland was benefited by the accession to the European Union, and how other countries from the region were benefited. There are some important differences, I believe, that also explain, I suppose, some differences in economic performance since 2004. And so that would be more or less the sort of book story. I don't think I said anything that would be original in comparison to what you can actually read in books. That Balcerowicz plan, first Wilczek's act, and then Balcerowicz plan, that they opened up our economy, that they, mainly Balcerowicz plan reduced inflation. They went, more like, tightening our monetary policy, that they basically introduced free market into Polish economy, and that, it had social costs, which basically made these reforms not particularly popular amongst at least part of Polish population. So that's sort of, let's say, official book story of what happened, I believe. From the ground level, if you will, I remember I attended a lecture in Warsaw University. That was around 2010, I believe, which is already, we've been in European Union for 6 years and so on and so forth. Poland is already pretty well developed at that time. We went through the 2008-2009 economic crisis, in good condition, which was also unusual for Europe and for the region as well. I remember I attended a lecture that was a visiting lecture by Professor Michael Sandel. He's a Harvard University professor of political philosophy. And he conducts his lectures in a way that is very interactive, basically asking various questions to students. And some of these questions, they pertain to, let's say, libertarian ideas or libertarian outlook in various aspects, like, strictly speaking, markets, but also some, ethical, context and so on and so forth. And basically, the entire discussion always starts with students voting whether they for one or the other solution, and then they try to investigate the reasons why they're into something or against something. And I remember Professor Sandel saying back then, in 2010, in Warsaw University, that because he travels the world and gives these lectures in various countries before various audiences, that he said that Polish audience is the most pro-market audience he had ever met, except Chinese. And I think that's sort of, if you will, this ground level story that I think is essentially true. So besides economic reforms, which were absolutely important, it's also worth mentioning that Polish people, they have very much pro-market attitude. They're very industrious people, hardworking, and I think into individual initiative. So this sort of spirit or psychological, spiritual profile of Polish people, I think is also something that should be taken into account, trying to explain, at least relative success of Poland in this respect.
Well, ideology, right? This is a great case study showing that ideology matters. In these cases, it's not some sort of determinist thing in terms of what is your economic structure, what is your IQ, those sorts of things, right? And for our more diehard listeners, you may remember that, I think it was more than a year ago, where we had Łukasz on for a previous episode of Radio Rothbard. We talked about Poland's past, Poland's political philosophy historically. And we covered similar topics, and we should probably link to that in the description where we talked about issues about how Poland had, for a long time, and I mean, even today, as far as Eastern European countries go, more of a Western orientation, more of an orientation toward markets, just different from much of the rest of Eastern Europe, and that has been beneficial in terms of economic growth. But yes, I would love to, of course, I could talk about that all day long, because I think Poland is a very interesting case study in all of that. However, you'll need to go to that other episode if you want more details, and so we'll link for people to go do that. We do need to talk about the issue, right, of EU membership for Poland, because what a lot of people come back and say is that, well, Poland improved because it was a member of the EU, and the EU practices wealth transfers. And so if you follow the EU structure, you're well aware of this, that especially for, say, the last 20 years, and really going back to the 90s, we see this in the case of Ireland, you join the EU, and the lower income countries were getting transfers in terms of money, cash, from the richer countries to the lower income countries. And even back in around the year 2000, we already knew this was going on with Ireland. Ireland benefited, of course, from being connected to the UK in terms of its economy, but also it was an English-speaking country. Ireland had finally abandoned all of its protectionism of the 20th century and has started to really skyrocket in terms of its economic growth. And Ireland's now one of the highest countries in terms of GDP per capita. But a lot of people just said, oh, it's just because they joined the EU and they got all this free money from Germany, France, etc., the rich EU countries. But if you look at some analyses of Poland's joining the EU, certainly that's a contributing factor, but that doesn't explain why Poland gained in their GDP per capita faster than other countries that were also on the receiving end of these transfers from the rich countries. So what is the thinking on that in Poland, right? Is this a huge part of your economy, or is this just something that's been helpful in terms of infrastructure and that sort of thing, right? For Americans, I guess we just think of a rich state subsidizing a poor state. You've got a state like Connecticut filled with rich people, and they get taxed, and a lot of that money flows into like a poor state like Mississippi or something. I mean, is that a good analogy for what happens in Europe, or is it more subtle than that? And right, but we would still say it still fails to explain Poland's relatively better performance than similar countries that also got that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question about European Union transfers being a contributing factor to the growth of Poland, I think. Of course, in Poland, that's also a part of public discussion and political debate. I wouldn't like to necessarily enter that debate, but maybe I will point to two facts. So first of all, maybe our listeners basically will try to make up their own minds about what to make of that. So it's true, of course, that other countries from the region, they received transfers from the European Union as well, the same as Poland. But Poland is the biggest beneficiary of these transfers if you compare to other countries. Overall, Poland received the biggest amount, if you will, the biggest transfer of all these countries. Net.
Well, clarifying question. Is that because Poland has the largest population of all of those countries, or is this on like a per capita basis gets more money?
Yeah, and of course that's the twist, right? So you're absolutely right. So this is basically, in terms of overall amount, but per capita we wouldn't be the leaders, right? So, make whatever you want of that fact. Of course, per capita, because we have bigger population, that wouldn't give us the position of a leader of these transfers. But still, I think this is something that importantly contributed, and the way it contributed again, I think you're right. Mainly, if you look at how these transfers were utilized then by the Polish side, they were devoted to a huge extent to basically creating, improving, building up infrastructure and some sort of, economic cohesion of our country. And that's also something that you see basically with your naked eyes when you come to Poland. I believe that you see that the infrastructure, roads and highways and other facilities, they I would say pretty impressive, and they are important element of international trade, movement of goods and people, and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't depreciate this fact that we entered the European Union. There is also, I think, an important aspect about us being the biggest beneficiaries overall. Also using these funds to build the infrastructure, or to help in building the infrastructure, I think also is important. But again, I think that's a mistake to look for one cause of this success. I think we have many causes. And as I said at the beginning, probably the biggest cause is the pro-market shock therapy economic reforms that we had in the 90s. But accession to the European Union is also, I think, an important cause. Maybe not the biggest, but clearly that's a big dog in the pack in many respects. So transfers, that's one thing, but also foreign investments that were facilitated by our accession to the European Union. Legal context of creating legal standards of economic activity and things like that. They also count. Also, in a sense, building some sort of reliable climate for economic investments, which is also connected with being part of the European Union and the Schengen zone, and so on and so forth. So I think these are important contributory factors or contributory causes. But if you allow me, I would like to go on a tangent a little bit here, because you mentioned...
Yes, go ahead.
Because you mentioned Ireland. When you were talking about Ireland, you said, well, of course that's an English-speaking country. And that actually sort of made me think about another aspect. I think that is pretty important, or factor that contributes to this Polish success, and that aspect, I think, is education. When you look at statistics like some sort of assessment of educational performance, that these assessments are run across the world, comparing different countries, students in different countries, you will see that Poland is actually very high in these statistics. So if I remember correctly, for instance, in maths, it's one of the leading countries in the world. So I think this is worth mentioning as well. So we have a very well educated population and people investing in education. Part of it being of course, learning English language. I think statistics here are also very favorable for Poland. Polish population is getting more and more fluent in the English language as the second language, which of course, for better or for worse, that's the international language of international trade, and so on and so forth, which is also an important factor contributing to the development of our society and economy. So I would also like to point to that, which is I don't know about the IQ, as you mentioned at the beginning or whatever, but I know about educational attainment. And Poles are very well educated if you compare them to other countries in the world, and also in the European Union, with specific stress put on STEM and English language.
Well, that's actually very different from Ireland, which is not known for emphasis on high levels of education or STEM, historically, for sure. And I would say in researching this episode, actually, I came across several headlines that said exactly that Poland is among the best educated countries in the world now in terms of educational attainment. And we both know that just historically, right, there's long been an emphasis on intellectual pursuits for the Polish middle class and upper class in terms of, right, we read books. We try to get educated, even if it's not formal education. Like, that is something that is emphasized, and that's long been true, and that's certainly not true everywhere. And then, of course, there's the learning of the English language, which is interesting. We don't really have time or the expertise to go into it a whole lot, but what we could do, of course, is contrast. Why has Poland improved so much while Japan is essentially stagnated in terms of its changes of GDP per capita, right? Because it's not just Poland moving up. It's the fact that Japan has gone nowhere in many ways over the last 30 years. And if you're my age and you kind of were growing up, you were a teenager in the early 90s and that sort of thing, you remember that everybody was talking about how Japan was going to soon be ruling the world and Japan would buy everything of value in America. It's kind of the same way that people were talking about China 10 years ago. And these things never actually seemed to come to happen. But the idea was that Japan was just going to be taking over, and it was amazing, and their economy would just be the largest in the world soon, in spite of the fact that their population is a small fraction of that of the U.S., et cetera, et cetera. But none of that ever happened, and in fact, Poland's economy has very much stagnated, and a lot of the data that the IMF was putting out on how Japan's economy has really been unimpressive. That was all before what's been going on in recent weeks with this bond crisis in Japan and the fact that Japan's got unusually high inflation and its crushing debt is really starting to affect their economy there. And so this may even be underestimating the gap that is now forming between Japan and Poland in terms of Poland being on top. So, we need to look at those issues too, right? We need to look at why some countries now compare unfavorably to Poland when they were so far ahead long ago. It's not just a Poland phenomenon. But certainly, right, as you say, education matters. The learning of English matters. The Japanese are notorious for not learning English. In fact, you can get all the way through graduate school and come out with a barely proficient reading of English level of proficiency. In Japan, this has actually long been a mystery. Why did the Japanese teach English so little in their schools? And so that may contribute as well. It cannot be said that, right, Japan did not have opportunities to trade with big, rich countries because the U.S., for Cold War reasons, right, gave lots of favorable trade conditions to the Japanese and so on to make sure that the U.S. was in the U.S. orbit, or make sure Japan was in the U.S. orbit and all of that. I agree with you. There's no single factor, but I think we could start pointing to some of these other issues that I think become relevant when we look more closely. And it's just not an assumption, even with the income transfers, that you're going to immediately catch up, right? Something that I mentioned before we went online and started recording was just that the continual mystery of East Germany, right? How East Germany before the war was a perfectly nice, prosperous part of Germany, right? It was in many ways the core of Prussia, and it was not the backward part of Germany, and yet so destroyed by the Soviet-style economy that to this day, if we look at maps of German incomes and infrastructure and welfare recipients and all of that sort of stuff, it's still worse in that part of Germany that was East Germany for all those years. And even though there's been huge transfers of wealth from the west to the east in terms of the welfare state and all that, it didn't erase that gap. But it seems the Poles have been pretty good at erasing that gap using whatever wealth transfers they received from the west. And so I do think there is something here that needs to be looked at. But you're right. It's not any single factor. Now, just to finish up then, I would say, what is your vision for the future? Do you think the polls are going to continue on a generally pro-market trajectory? Or are they doing what so many middle-income countries start to do as they start to get rich? Is, well, now we need to start focusing on regulating more. Now we need to worry about quality of life. Now we need to do all these things that the rich countries of the West do, and which in many places they think makes those countries better, but it in fact kills our economic growth and innovation and all of that. What do you think the future holds?
Well, that's of course a very difficult question. I don't know whether I really can offer anything particularly informative here. I mean, let me maybe first address that by way of asking about the character of Polish people, because I mentioned earlier that Polish people they very industrious, they pro-market, and they hardworking, and so on and so forth. So this is for sure true for people my generation, maybe a bit younger, and of course also older people. But how it is for much younger people in Poland, frankly speaking, I don't know. And I suspect that there might be some sort of change going on. Sometimes, of course, I talk to young people, so I see that there is some difference. For instance, for my generation, people that were brought up under communism, partly, finding a job, a good job, going to university, educating yourself, maybe starting your own business, getting rich if you can. That was very important element of our sort of outlook, because we were coming out of poverty generally as a society, as a generation or a few generations. So that might be changing right now because we are getting richer. So the younger generation might have a different outlook a little bit. But still, when you look, for instance, at the current presidential elections, the results that we have after the first round of these elections, we see that there is some pretty substantive, I would say, pretty big support for political options that are pro-market, more or less, let's say, but generally we would classify. Anyway, in politics you also always have to make compromises, especially in democratic politics. So that's clear. So let's just sort of be straightforward and say that there is a support in the younger generation for pro-market policies. So difficult to say, frankly. I really don't have any data on that. There might be some change going on. Who knows? We'll see. But on the other hand, Poland is not a country yet that accumulated a lot of wealth. So, okay, GDP per capita, purchasing power adjusted or whatever, is growing and we have economic growth. But we also have a pretty, huge handicap from the past. I think we're still on this trajectory to accumulate wealth, to build it. So this is not yet the situation of Western European countries like Germany or France or what have you. So maybe that would suggest that we'll keep going. I hope we will. So.
Well, yeah, certainly I hope so too. And it also, just as an example to the rest of the world, right? We have so many problems in other parts of the world where, for example, There was shock therapy in Chile, for example, but the Chilean reform in favor of markets has been so tainted by the whole Pinochet experience that that's used as an example of how, well, market reform is tied to fascism. And that's not a problem with the Polish experience, fortunately. So we need that as an experience, as an example. And so I would say so far so good from just looking in from the outside. And it's unfortunate that Japan has really just flattened out in terms of its growth, because of course Japan theoretically should just be ahead of Poland forever, because it started out 70 years ago had started building much faster in terms of market reform. But you build up debt, you turn away from markets, and these things happen. But, well, with that, we better go ahead and wrap up this episode. Thank you, Professor Łukasz Dominiak at Nicholas Copernicus University in Poland, for joining us today. Thank you for your insights. We will be back next week with more here on Radio Rothbard, so we'll see you next time.